In this final lesson on the topic of Augustine, what we're going to do is talk about the relationship between Augustinian philosophy on the one hand and the idea of the problem of evil on the other. Now, fundamentally, Augustine is one of the key early medieval thinkers when thinking about the idea of the problem of evil. And so it's important that we're going to spend some time in this lesson focusing here on the idea of the problem of evil as elucidated by St. Augustine. So, as noted, what we're going to be doing is examining the nature of the problem of evil in relation to the ways in which St. Augustine approaches the issue. Augustinian philosophy and Augustinian theodicy specifically, we'll talk about what theodicy means in a second, but Augustinian theodicy is fundamentally one of the major approaches, major Christian approaches to the problem of evil. So, what do we mean when we talk about theodicy? What is theodicy? Well, a theodicy is simply an explanation, if you will, an explanation for how we can have the existence of, on the one hand, evil and evil things taking place, with the coexistence of an all-loving God. And this is fundamentally the distinction here, because of course one of the things that we have to know about, or that we do know about God at least, is this idea of him being, at least from a Christian perspective, him being very or being all loving, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, all powerful. And the distinction here that we make is that how can a God that is all loving, that loves us infinitely, and is all powerful, has the power to do whatever he so chooses, why does he therefore seemingly allow evil to exist? And this is obviously an argument against the existence of God. It's not necessarily particularly convincing, at least in my opinion, but it is still nevertheless very, very, very powerful. It's still very, very important. And so, as a result of which, we have to think about how to justify them. And that's what a theodicy seeks to do. Augustinian theodicy, specifically the way St. Augustine approaches it, is based principally on both Christian interpretations as well as some of the ancient Greek and classical interpretations of business, fundamentally. Of philosophy. This is, of course, coming from the idea of Plato specifically. Plato believed that everything in existence has its ideal form, and we've had previous lessons on this when we looked at ancient philosophy. So if you want to see more about that, have a look over on those videos on ancient philosophy. And according to Plato, the realm of the forms is what the imperfect world is based on. So we sort of have this perfected conceptualization of the world of forms, which is really why we suggest that some of these early medieval philosophers definitely take quite Platonistic understandings of reality, that there is this idea of Platonism, there is this idea of the realm of the forms on the one hand, and there's this idea of the imperfect world on the other. Plato believed that imperfection was just part of the way things are. But for Augustine, he did not want to accept this understanding, this specific understanding of reality. He instead believed that God created the universe, and so he did not deliberately create a universe that was with imperfections, that was rife with imperfections. And so, according to Genesis and according to the basic biblical interpretation, God saw what he had made, and what he had made was very good. So how can we square this? How can we square this very clear understanding of the book of Genesis with the idea of Plato's theories of forms and Plato's understanding of the ideal and the imperfect? How can we make this delineation here? And how can Augustine reconcile these ideas? So we've noted already what the inconsistent triad is when it comes to the concept of God from a Christian, Judeo-Christian understanding and a Judeo-Christian perspective. God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, and so as a result of which you cannot accept theoretically that God would be deliberately evil or could create a world deliberately with evil in it. And so as a result of which, what Augustine suggested was that evil was not a real positive quality. Instead, he believed that evil was simply the privation of good, this being known as, and in the Latin, this idea of privatio boni. What this essentially means is, just like how a shadow it does not actually represent a separate existence, it is instead just simply referring to the negation of light, so too does evil not have a separate existence, it is just simply the negation of good. And so this is really the basic understanding of the Augustinian problem of evil and the Augustinian response to and solution to the problem of evil. But where does it come from? Where does this cessation of light, in the sense of the cessation of good, where does this actually come from? And according to Augustine, there is of course biblical responses to this, and there is biblical explanations for where this all derives from. In Augustine's view, evil first came into the world through the fall, the fall of the angels. He said that the angels were made perfect but received less grace than others, and as a result of which they fell away from God, resulting in the misuse of their free will. There's just a basic quotation here from Augustine's Confessions, suggesting that, quote, "Free will is the cause of our doing evil. Thy just judgments is the cause of our having to suffer the consequences." So what Augustine simply does here is he wraps a number of different conceptualizations together. He understands the idea of of evil and the concept of where evil comes from as part of and wrapped into and fundamentally conceptualized around our understanding of evil and our understanding of free will. Now, in terms of critiquing Augustine in this regard, you could come to the conclusion that evil seems to be a little bit more than just a negation of the good. It seems to be something more definite. It seems to be more substantive than just it being the negation of what is good. Examples of evil include things like the Holocaust or like the slave trade. It seems that these things cannot be just negations of the good. Does it really make sense that where good doesn't exist, something like the Holocaust could take place? This doesn't seem like a particularly easy thing to reconcile and to understand. Secondly, Augustine's view that some angels were given more grace than others is actually not explained by Augustine himself. So it's sort of just thrown out there as a concept and as an idea, but it isn't actually given much in the way of specific understanding, and not really given that much of the ability to essentially reconcile this in any greater detail. A more modern and prominent philosopher who challenges some of the Augustinian conceptualizations of the problem of evil is John Hick, who says, quote, "The idea of an unqualified good creature committing sin is self-contradictory and unintelligible. If the angels are finitely perfect, then even though they are in some important sense free of sin, they never in fact do so." So we have an example here of John Hick responding to some of the conceptualizations of Augustine's views on free will and on the problem of evil. Now, fundamentally, of course, these are lessons that are essentially trying to trace the history of Western philosophy through the ages, going from the beginnings in the ancient period all the way through to the medieval period. So I'm not going to spend too much time formally critiquing the deep philosophical and theological conceptions of Augustinian philosophy. We might do that in the future, but for now what I'm going to do is draw your attention to the bibliography, the citations, and the further reading for you on this particular topic. The next 2 lessons is going to spend some time talking about Boethius, and then we will move on to looking at some of the contributions from the Islamic Golden Age and the ways in which Islam actually contributed to and developed into this ideas of medieval philosophy in and around the same time. You can't really discuss the concept of medieval philosophy without reference to Islam, nor can you do so without reference to Judaism, and we'll look at Maimonides in future lessons time as well, before we then start focusing on people like Anselm of Canterbury, St. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, and people like William of Ockham, all of which will be sort of drawing our attention towards the end of our studies in this particular course on medieval philosophy.